Let's talk about, I don't know. It's obviously easier to assess this in hindsight than, in the moments over these years, but was there ever a chance of like what Buber or Arendt, to the extent that she had like an affirmative vision, was there really ever a chance for that, or were the circumstances that allowed Israel to exist sort of like it was baked into the DNA that this was going to lead to where we are? I mean, as an imperial outpost, essentially, could it have ever been anything but?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult question. I would say that they probably didn't have a chance to win out on the idea of a binational state, just because the type of nationalism it proposed, where there's not a zero-sum game of coexistence, went against not only the trends of Zionism, but against Arab nationalism. However, I'd say that some of their elements of thinking about what would be a more decent state. So Buber, by 1949, is now kind of moving on to thinking, okay, it's a state of Israel now. I'm not going to propose the binational thing anymore, but how can we certainly come up with a just resolution for the refugee situation? How can we bring about equality of the remaining Palestinian Arab population in the state of Israel? And how can we create a more just society? I'd say there were steps along the way, and one of my chapters kind of looks at possibilities where they still would have had a Jewish state in the conventional sense, but they could have had peaceful relations with the neighboring Arab states and worked out a deal with Palestine's Arabs that would not have broken it. So there were elements along the way. I would say that Arendt's diagnosis of these pathologies that they couldn't shake keep getting in the way. This element that if it's tribal nationalism and eternal anti-Semitism, then you can't give any ground. So I suppose it's these fundamental pathologies, the need for a conventional Jewish nation state that keeps preventing more just prospects. And this goes on even with the prospects of a two-state, right? After the 1967 war, certainly Israel's in a very strong position. And just from conventional Israeli interest, agreeing to a Palestinian state would not have hurt it strategically or economically, but these fundamental pathologies of never giving in get in the way. So that's why your question's difficult. I guess it does come down to breaking down these pathologies. And, that's still the problem in 2023 is this mindset is still with Israeli Jews and among Jews in the United States and the diaspora that still identify so closely with Israeli policies and with conventional Zionism.
I mean, it feels fruitless to ask like what is possible with what exists right now. I mean, but it also feels like, we're doing this interview. We gotta ask that question on some level. I know you write about Edward Said's Reformation notions, but also that was from, also a different era on the trajectory of where we are now. Like what, it seems impossible to imagine a two-state solution with the 700,000 illegal settlers in the West Bank. It also seems hard to imagine a one-state solution, but it also seems hard to imagine that the status quo this idea that, Israel's going to mow the lawn every now and then, or, continue to suppress and occupy millions of people ad infinitum, it also seems unlikely. If there is a way out of this, what do you see it as?
Yeah, I mean, you're correct that right now there's nothing promising, at least on a large scale, on the horizon. And so it seems now pointless to even talk about, okay, are you more of a two-state advocate or a one-state advocate? I think one does need this transformation or reformation of just what does it mean of Jewish self-determination. So, look, I take hope in that, at least in the United States. So, the United States is roughly tied with Israel for the largest Jewish population. There's certain among the Jewish community, not among the established Jewish organizations, but among the population at large, particularly those under 40. And so, if among that the Jewish community, there's now an openness toward humanizing the Palestinians, looking back at the Nakba. I mean, something like the Nakba, I don't think I knew the term, the Nakba, when I'm in college back in the 1980s. I'd known somehow that Palestinians had to flee, but the line then was it was mostly their fault. Now, I think among young Jews who have any interest in the topic, they take it for granted that the Nakba happened. That was an awful thing. And they take it for granted that there is this fundamental contradiction between a Jewish state and a democratic state. So I take primary hope in that you've had this big change in the American Jewish community. Granted, within Israel, looks to be going more the opposite direction, in that including young Israeli Jews are becoming more hardline. And so there I don't have an easy out other than to note that one does need some kind of transformation among the Jewish community. There certainly are groups in Israel like Breaking the Silence, Association for Civil Rights in Israel, the Human Rights Group at Salem, those who put together 972 magazine. So there are these pockets of Jewish activists who are interacting. You probably know about the initiative of A Land for All, which is made up of Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arab citizens that are coming up with this blueprint of general principles, where it would be a confederation of two states based on the 1967 border, so a Jewish state of Israel and a Palestinian Arab states. But there would be open borders. One would be able to work in either community. So the problem of, say, 500, 600, 700,000 Israeli settlers in itself is not an issue if they actually want to just live in Palestine for spiritual, cultural reasons. The same way for Palestinians who descend from refugees. They want to be close to their home communities, even if they can't be citizens of this new state of Israel under this confederation. They would have travel and employment rights. Granted, this is all still just speculative hope, but I think you have a growing number of Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews kind of thinking through what it would.
Well,
sorry, no.
No, it's I am curious though, because the idea of these Israeli settlers, the 700,000 settlers, agreeing to basically live in Palestinian territory, and there being border crossings, and it being maybe Israel-Palestine, right? Like I think a one-state solution is really the only path forward. That there would have to be real truth and reconciliation and major seismic changes in the legality of these kinds of settlements, because it's the Israeli settlers in Palestinian territory, in those borders that you describe, are the most right-wing in the entire country.
Yeah, this is a big problem. And look, I think the one thing that's the hardest to confront is Israeli Jews would need to do a full reckoning, right, of what was done and what is being done to Palestinians. That's certainly not something that's easy from any society. And so the settlers, are a big obstacle. Look, I think it's going to have to be some kind of broader transformation. To me, it seems the vanguard would be those Israeli Jews who are actively working with Palestinians, even now are still bravely kind of condemning the current onslaughts, and who are interacting in protest and resistance with Palestinians, along with an increasingly sizable American Jewish community. The settlers are going to be perhaps the last bastion. It's true that I remember I did a tour once, it was a decade ago, of Ariel, one of the settlements that's was built precisely to be an obstacle toward a contiguous West Bank. But the person who was showing us around and was doing a propaganda tour for Ariel, he said, even if Ariel became a state of Palestine, they should want to keep the factories redeveloped. So I was struck by that. I don't want to make too much of that because you're right, Emma, that the settlers, by and large, are the most hardline elements. But if one looks for possibilities of broader change, then even for those settlers that are willing to live in a much different arrangement, and Noam Chomsky has talked about this in the past, that if settlers are told, okay, you need to make your peace with this new state of Palestine, you can decide, do you want to stay in Israel, or do you want to work out a deal where you're no longer getting all the bulk of the resources, the bulk of the water? And so there'd be that. But the settlers do represent the most significant problem that has to be overcome. I can't say I or anyone else has an easy solution. To me, it does have to come from the vanguard elements and then to spread outward.
When you cite American Jewry changing, and my experience is very similar to yours in terms of having any awareness of 1948 or what led up to that, growing up, whether it was in college or Hebrew school, whatever it was. But is it American Jewry, or is it American Jewry in providing at least the moral authority for political elements in this country to condition our aid to the extent that, Israel's got now these leases off of these oil leases off of Gaza, and they're going to be getting revenue ultimately from the Ben Gurion Canal, which could theoretically supplant, but they don't have the ability to sort of at this point, anyways, to mass produce the missiles needed for the Iron Dome. Is that essentially the how it will work? Is that this is not going to? There may be a vanguard in Israel, but there is not a critical mass, and certainly the trajectory hasn't been in that direction for them to move in a different direction, unless U.S. uses its leverage to the extent that it has any anymore, and also its ability to sort of nurture nascent developing elements of that vanguard.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I think when most of us American Jews who are very troubled by Israel's policies and by the U.S. support and by the support of American Jewish establishments, we do rightly think our value added is to convey not in our name, that this is not being pro-Jewish to just kind of keep supporting Israeli militarism and the happy coexistence between U.S. militarism and Israeli militarism. So that's our value added, is it's not being done on behalf of Jews, and it gives more validation, more legitimacy for criticism. It makes non-Jews just a little bit more comfortable doing sharp criticisms without being denounced as anti-Semitic. So that is our top value, and not just in the United States, in Europe too. But I do think Israelis do still look to Americans and to the American Jewish community as support, but also as some kind of benchmark of what's going on. I know there's also lots of suspicion, but I think that element could, has potential for not the right-wing Israelis, like not most of the settlers, but for a broader left of center elements that would go beyond just the Vanguard now.
The coalitions that we saw maybe mobilizing against of the autocratic rule and the earlier, and whether they're at least that's the pond, as it were, where one would fish, I guess. Lastly, let me just ask you this. Is the road to a two-state solution and a one-state solution more or less the same for the first 5 years, let's say? I mean, like, is what would be needed for either one of those outcomes seems to me to be more or less the same for, the first decade, which is to provide resources and support for the development and of both a civil sort of society within, Gaza and the West Bank, and also sort of like a physical, just like repair as well.
In that sense, yes, it probably would be more or less the same. Maybe it's more or less the same in terms of condemning settlements. Because another thing I do is international law. So in my final chapter, I do make a plea not to just abandon all two-state advocacy. So don't confuse two-state advocacy with the Oslo process that I argue was warped from the beginning. But in so much as there was this global consensus that was worked out by the late 1970s that called for an independent Palestinian state, and that called the settlements and the perpetuation of the occupation as not only illegal, but the primary obstacle. All that's part of what's broadly called the two-state global consensus. So I think there's reason to keep using that leverage that you get from repeated UN resolutions. Sometimes they're even repeated at the UN Security Council, the rare times the US will abstain. And so the only thing I worry about once is to just completely reject any kind of talk of two-state is you're disarming yourself from some very useful international law, UN kind of resolutions that will influence, say, people that are groups that are more in the middle, like many governments.
That's really interesting. And a fascinating perspective. Really appreciate the book.
Thank you.
Jewish Self-Determination Beyond Zionism, Lessons from Hannah Arendt and Other Pariahs. Jonathan Graubart, we will put a link to your book at majority.fm and in our podcast and YouTube description. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, great. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Emma.
Thanks so much.